Tonight you'll step inside the twisted rise of Nazi Germany, and how for a moment Europe stood one breath away from falling entirely. This is not a lecture, it's a second-person immersive journey. You won't just watch the Third Reich take shape, you'll feel its cold logic, its fire, its lies, from backroom promises to Blitzkrieg thunder, from dreams of empire to scorched surrender. You'll walk through the moment when history held its breath, so breathe slowly and drift into a story darker than sleep. You wake up in the battered remnants of what used to be a proud empire. Germany, 1919. The Great War is over, though it doesn't feel that way. There's no victory parade here, just broken windows, angry men, and the bitter stench of defeat wafting through Berlin's frost-bitten streets. The Treaty of Versailles hangs like a noose around your neck. Reparations, disarmament, and territorial losses have gutted your once mighty nation. You feel it in your bones in every loaf of bread that costs a wheelbarrow of marks. You don't eat dinner, you negotiate with inflation. The streets throb with unrest. Men in ill-fitting uniforms bark about betrayal, about Marxists, about Jews, about traitors. But no one listens. Not yet. Everyone's too busy starving or surviving. Germany's democracy is born in this chaos, a shaky child called the Weimar Republic, held hostage by debt and dancing cabaret. You are part of a country haunted by its past and paralyzed by its present. And in the beer halls, in the smoke and fury, a figure begins to speak. Adolf, not yet the Führer, just a frustrated Austrian with a toothbrush mustache and a head full of grievances. He captivates you, oddly. He's not a war hero, he was a messenger, but somehow, when he speaks, your heart races. He doesn't just talk, he transmits. His words crackle through the room, like fire catching dry straw. You nod. Yes, the treaty was unfair. Yes, Germany deserves to rise again. And yes, maybe democracy isn't the answer. After all, what has voting gotten you besides soup kitchens and shame? By 1923, he's bold enough to try a coup, the infamous beer hall putsch. You follow him into the streets of Munich, full of swagger and delusion, only to be stopped by bullets and batons. You end up in prison. He ends up with a light sentence and a typewriter. He calls it Mein Kampf, but really, it's your struggle too. You read it, or at least pretend to, and feel vindicated. Finally, someone has a plan. The years pass, the Great Depression hits, and suddenly the democracy that seemed fragile becomes a ghost. Unemployment soars, hope vanishes, and there he is again. Not with guns this time, with ballots. Hitler, your voice in the wilderness, becomes Chancellor in 1933, just like that. Legally, democratically, sort of. You don't ask too many questions. You're just glad the trains run on time. And now things move fast. The Reichstag burns, suspiciously convenient. Emergency powers are invoked. Opposition parties disappear, first figuratively, then literally. The radio hums with praise. You march in parades. You salute the flag. You whisper a little less at night. Fear and pride blur into one intoxicating feeling. Germany is back. But you're not free. Not really. Your neighbors vanish. The newspapers print only good news. Jews are barred from jobs, shops, schools. You say nothing. Or worse, you nod. After all, this is for Germany, right? Sacrifices must be made. And the streets are clean now, aren't they? Meanwhile, the world watches. Sort of. France and Britain issue stern warnings and go back to sipping tea. America's too busy crashing its own economy. The League of Nations holds meetings, and nothing else. You rebuild your army in secret, then in public. You put on rallies that dazzle and terrify, all red banners and blinding lights. Nuremberg is your stage, and the audience, the world, can't look away. Historians still argue whether Hitler's rise was inevitable or engineered, spontaneous or scripted, but for you living it, none of that matters. You're no longer humiliated. You're part of something vast, something vengeful. You don't just want Germany to stand again, You want it to rule. The air smells different now, not of ash and bread lines, but of oil and steel. 1,000 factories hum with warlike purpose, tanks that can outrun horses, planes that can bomb from the clouds, and behind it all, you sense the rhythm of something unstoppable. Europe is asleep at the wheel, but you're wide awake and marching. But that's enough for tonight. The next conquest can wait until morning. You don't start as a tyrant. That title comes slowly, like frost seeping into bone. At first, you're just chancellor. But you don't govern, you consume. Every department, every institution, every rival becomes another cog in your gleaming machine. The press starts printing only one name. The courts forget how to object. Even the churches bow their heads, some willingly, some with a pistol at the back of the skull. You don't walk, you march, always with spectacle. You understand something the rest of the world has forgotten. People will forgive anything if it comes with a parade. The world watches those torchlit rallies and thinks, well, at least they're organized. Your enemies, they're degenerates. Your allies, true Germans. Your destiny, Europe, at minimum. The world, if there's time. And then, the Reichstag burned to ash. How convenient. You declare a national emergency, as one does. Civil liberties vanish like smoke. Your opponents disappear into the night, into protective custody. No one protects them. You pass the Enabling Act, which is either the dullest name or the most honest. It enables everything, rule by decree, for the good of the people, of course. The democracy that elected you now hands you the keys to its own coffin. Your party is no longer one among many. It is the only one. The swastika unfurls over every building, every school. Children learn to draw it before they can write their names. They chant your name before breakfast. Even their lullabies now rhyme with conquest. Outside Germany, the world still frowns, but does nothing. France grumbles. Britain clutches its pearls. America sighs and retreats into its shell. And you keep building. Autobahns crisscross the country. Factories roar with purpose. You turn unemployment into uniforms. You promise bread, but more importantly, you deliver pride. What they don't see, or refuse to see, is what happens under the shiny veneer. Book burnings light up college plazas. Jewish professors vanish. Intellectuals flee. Scientists pack their notes and their shame and head west. But you don't mind. Science, like everything else, now serves your will. The only theory that matters is Lebensraum, living space, and you intend to carve it from someone else's home. Historians still debate how complicit the average German was. Were you a true believer, or just too afraid to dissent? Did you cheer out of loyalty or survival? Maybe both, maybe neither. The truth is, it's easier to follow orders when you think they lead to greatness. Even easier when the orders promise revenge for Versailles. You don't just want land, you want purification. Racial hygiene, they call it, a grotesque blend of science and delusion. Jews, Romani, the disabled, homosexuals. Anyone who doesn't fit into your twisted mythology of the Aryan ideal is marked for removal. First from jobs, then from neighborhoods, then from history. But all of that is background noise, at least for now. Because your eyes are set outward, you've got the weapons, the propaganda, the people, and now you have a plan. You test the waters with the Rhineland. You send troops into the demilitarized zone, and you wait. France should react. Britain should protest, but no one does. It's like poking a sleeping lion and discovering it's already dead. You grin. The gamble paid off. Next comes Austria, the Anschluss. You claim it's a homecoming, a reunion of Germanic brothers. You roll in tanks, and the crowds welcome you with flowers and Sieg Heils. No shots fired, no resistance. You don't annex Austria. It practically throws itself into your arms, and the world, still watching, still silent. By now, you realize the West is terrified of war, almost as terrified as you are of delay. You don't want a slow grind. You want lightning. You want conquest by calendar. And then there's Czechoslovakia, or rather, the Sudetenland, home to ethnic Germans. You claim they're being oppressed. You demand protection. Chamberlain flies to Munich, hands you part of a country, and flies home waving a scrap of paper like a boy with a hall pass. Peace in our time, he says. You try not to laugh too loud. But your war machine's not just political, it's mechanical. You pour resources into tanks, planes, logistics, communication. No other country is preparing for war like you are, because no other country believes it will happen. They still think war means trenches. You know it means engines. Factories hum all night. Children are taught to salute before they're taught to read. You build not just weapons, but the will to use them. And under it all, always, the rhythm of boots, synchronized, euphoric, and terrifying. And so, with your enemies snoring and your generals salivating, you look east. Poland awaits. The world doesn't know it yet, but the fuse has been lit. Europe's about to learn a new word, Blitzkrieg. But that can wait until morning. You don't conquer Europe with tea parties. You do it with tanks, tarmac, and terrifying precision. And most importantly, you do it fast. Speed isn't just a strategy, it's your religion now. Germany cannot win a long war. That's the dirty little truth everyone in the Reichstag turned stage set knows. So you plan for a short, brutal symphony of violence, a crescendo of fire and fuel that smothers resistance before it even begins to scream. But first you need the instruments. So you tune your economy not to peace, not to prosperity, but to production. Guns before butter. That's your mantra. You pour everything into rearmament. Civilian factories become arms manufacturers. Trains carry more steel than passengers. Children learn about horsepower and calibers before they've even tasted chocolate. By the late 1930s, the numbers are staggering. Panzer divisions are rolling off the line. The Luftwaffe, once a whispered rumour in hangars, is now a thundering reality above the clouds. Junkers, Messerschmitts, Heinkels, each plane a promise that the next war won't be like the last. You even build a highway system not for family vacations, but to move tanks faster. Call it efficiency, call it obsession. Either way, it's working. Your generals, especially a man named Guderian, talk of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, but you rename it with marketing flair, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And let's be honest, it sounds cooler in German. It's elegant in its brutality. Paralyze, puncture, encircle. Let the enemy flail. Let them chase their own tail, while your tanks zip past, radio-connected and roaring, like wolves in formation. But tech alone doesn't conquer continents. You need people to believe, so you whip them into a frenzy. Every poster sings of strength. Every newsreel shows your legions. You glorify sacrifice, discipline, and above all, speed. Even death starts to seem urgent, punctual, almost polite. Meanwhile, you secure resources the old-fashioned way, by stealing them. You suck Austria dry. The Sudetenland yields factories, mines, and convenient geography. Every territory you swallow becomes another engine in your death machine. And the rest of Europe, they watch you chew and smile, hoping you'll stop after one more bite. Historians still argue whether appeasement was cowardice or calculus. Did Chamberlain truly believe he was preserving peace, or was he buying time for Britain to rearm? The truth is muddier than your propaganda would admit, but from your perch it looks like weakness, and weakness invites war. Now let's talk allies. Italy's your drunk cousin at a family reunion, loud, unreliable, and always 3 steps behind. But you tolerate Mussolini for the optics. He marches too, after all. Then there's Japan, carving its own empire out of Asia. You nod politely across continents, share a few ideological winks, and sign pacts. The Axis is born not out of friendship, but mutual convenience. And the Soviets? The Soviets are a whole other story. For now, you shake hands. Molotov and Ribbentrop Split a map with straight lines and crooked hearts. Poland will be carved like a roast. You both smile, the knives are already in your sleeves. And while this geopolitical theatre unfolds, your people cheer. The economy's booming. The streets are orderly. There's a car in every driveway, and a uniform in every closet. No one talks about the camps, the arrests, the disappearances. They whisper instead about how the trains run on time, and how the Führer brought pride back. You've turned a nation's trauma into triumph, and now you want it all. You watch your panzers roll during training exercises and feel giddy. These machines aren't just metal, they're metaphors. They move like thought. You've taken Clausewitz and put him on wheels. You know deep down that war is about momentum, and you're not going to stop until your gears grind the continent flat. So when you look east, you don't see Poland. You see timing. You see a quick kill, a swift occupation. You see another launch pad for the next conquest. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact gives you cover. The world won't stop you, you're certain. France and Britain might huff and puff, but they're out of breath and out of guts. The United States? Please, they're still debating whether to get involved in anything more serious than baseball. You give the order, September 1, 1939. Operation Fall Weiss. The point of no return. And yet you sleep soundly that night, because in your mind this isn't war, it's choreography, a precision dance of tanks and bombers and screaming boots. You've built the stage, rehearsed every line, greased every gear. Blitzkrieg isn't just a tactic now, it's your language, your poetry, and Europe is about to learn it the hard way. But for now, just rest. Tomorrow, the storm begins. Morning comes not with birdsong, but with rumbling engines. You don't knock on Poland's door, you kick it in. September 1st, 1939. At exactly 4:45 a.m., the battleship Schleswig-Holstein opens fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The sky splits with thunder, and the world's last illusions of peace crumble before the smoke even clears. Your Luftwaffe descends like hornets. Bombs fall on railways, depots, and communication lines before anyone can answer a phone. It's not just destruction, it's disorientation. The first wave isn't about territory, it's about chaos. While Poland blinks, your panzers roll. You've invaded with over 1 million troops, 2,000 tanks, and absolute conviction. Polish cavalry charges at armoured vehicles with sabres. It's brave, yes, but also it's 1939. Your tanks are fast, your artillery coordinated, and your radios work better than your enemy's boots. Every division has a role. Every weakness is exploited before it can be reinforced. The Blitzkrieg debuts in full. It's not a fight, it's a rupture. You smash through Polish defences, not to engage, but to bypass. You don't need to fight everyone, just enough to crack the line. Once it breaks, your armour flows through the gap like water. You flood cities, seize bridges, surround armies, before they understand what's happening. You turn entire divisions into islands. Then you cut the boats. The Allies finally move, sort of. Britain and France declare war on Germany 2 days later. Headlines scream about honour and duty, but no one invades. No bombs fall on Berlin. The so-called phony war begins. A theatre of bluff and hesitation, while Poland burns. You'd laugh if you weren't busy redrawing maps. To the east, the Soviets move in mid-September, punctual as agreed. Stalin's troops cross the Polish border from the other side, slicing through the back door. Poland, squeezed from both jaws, folds. In just over a month, it's gone, a nation erased, parcelled up between two ideologies destined to hate each other. But not just yet. Historians still argue whether Poland had a chance. Could better coordination with the Allies have saved them? Could their forces have held longer if the West had moved faster? The tragedy is, we'll never know. All we know is that your Blitzkrieg worked, and you are elated. But here's the thing, conquest is messy. You have to clean up after the victory parade. So you implement what you euphemistically call Germanization. Cities are renamed, schools erased, intellectuals arrested, Jews herded into ghettos. Soon worse, the architecture of genocide begins with clipboards and train schedules. And while Poland lies shattered, you look west. The show isn't over, it hasn't even begun. Meanwhile, you start repositioning. France and Britain have declared war, sure, but their troops are still drinking tea behind the Maginot Line. You call it the Blitzkrieg, the sitting war. It's like they're waiting for an invitation. Back home, morale is electric. Propaganda frames Poland not as conquest, but as correction, the return of stolen lands, the rescue of ethnic Germans. Posters smile, radios cheer. No one talks about what really happened in the forests of Katyn, or the burning synagogues, or the weeping columns of refugees walking into winter. You don't rest, you reorganize. You study the Allied responses, or lack thereof, and realize something beautiful. They're afraid, not just of you, but of war itself. The trauma of 1914 still clings to their bones, and you, the architect of fear, will use their hesitation like a sword. Winter slows the campaign. Your generals begin whispering about the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, the soft flank around the Maginot Line. But for now, you let the world breathe, just for a moment. Let them think it's over. Let them believe Poland was the price for peace. At night, in your Alpine retreat or Berlin office, you stare at maps, not as borders, as puzzles. You move pins, juggle timetables, dream of air superiority and tank pincers. You're not satisfied with victory. You want perfection. France is next, but it must fall faster than Poland. That's the goal. A single blow, surgical and swift. You don't just want to defeat your enemies. You want to humiliate them. And still, the world underestimates you. They think you'll stall now, that you'll consolidate. But you've built momentum, and Blitzkrieg isn't a tool, it's a tempo. To pause would be to lose the rhythm. The music of war has begun, and you're its conductor. But that crescendo can wait until your eyes open again. Spring in Europe should smell like blooming chestnuts and wet stone, but this year it smells like oil and anticipation. April 1940. You've spent the winter rehearsing. Now it's time to dance again. Your eyes flick north. Denmark and Norway, not exactly titans, but essential to your strategy. You don't just want land, you want access, resources, control of the North Sea, and those fjords, perfect for submarines. So you hit the switch. Denmark falls in a day. Literally, one single day. You barely break stride. It's almost embarrassing. Resistance evaporates. The Danish king folds with as much grace as surrender can allow. You set up shop, hoist the flag, and move on. But Norway is trickier. The terrain is a nightmare, all rock and forest and stubborn coastline. Not ideal for tanks, which don't love mountains. But you improvise. Paratroopers drop from grey skies like iron hail. Your navy steams toward key ports, while the Luftwaffe clears the path ahead. Oslo blinks. Narvik burns. This isn't just conquest, it's choreography on ice. Still, the Norwegians fight back. They even sink a few of your ships. Britain tries to intervene, finally, but it's too little, too clumsy, too late. The Allies bungle the landing, retreat, and leave the locals twisting in the wind. You secure Norway after a few weeks of sharp teeth and cold fingers. Why does it matter? Because now you control the coast. You've denied Britain an important launching point. You have access to Swedish iron ore, vital for keeping your war machine fed. And speaking of Sweden, they stay neutral. You let them. For now. But even amidst your victories, you notice something strange. A pattern, a pulse. The faster you move, the more success you taste. The world simply isn't ready for your speed. And that makes you greedy. Historians still debate whether invading Norway was worth the cost in ships and men. Some argue it stretched your forces thin. Others say it was a masterstroke of logistics and foresight. Either way, you emerge with a smirk. Scandinavia is tucked under your belt. The Reich now has its icy hat. Back in Berlin, people cheer. They still believe you're invincible. Or rather, they need to. Every victory gives them a reason not to ask questions. Not about rationing, not about neighbours who vanish, not about whispers of camps and trains that don't come back. And you? You're already looking west, the Low Countries. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. They're neutral. So was Poland. So was Norway. You're not in the habit of asking permission. The French are dug in behind the Maginot Line, convinced you'll come at them head on. You won't. You see a forest, the Ardennes. It's thick, supposedly impassable to tanks, which makes it perfect. Where the Allies see obstacles, you see opportunities. That's the beauty of your Blitzkrieg. It's not just force, it's surprise, misdirection. You let them think you'll repeat the past, then you rewrite it instead. But not yet. You bide your time, you finalize plans, train the soldiers, refine the routes. Every move calculated, every piece aligned. This isn't just a military operation, it's a sleight of hand. You're about to pull a disappearing act, turning the French line of defense into a meaningless relic. Meanwhile, the British are watching, nervously sipping tea behind the channel. They don't trust you, but they're not sure what to do. They talk about containment, about deterrence, all the words of a nervous guest, trying to delay the inevitable brawl. And so you play your part, you shake hands, you offer smiles, but your tanks are already rumbling toward Belgium. You're not planning a war, you're preparing a performance. You'll knock down country after country like dominoes, and the world will gasp. But that gasp can wait until you wake again. May 10, 1940. You unleash hell with the punctuality of a train conductor. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, all struck in a single coordinated breath. It's not war anymore. It's an art form. Blitzkrieg has evolved from a tactic into a signature, and Europe is your canvas. You hit the Netherlands first, but not head-on. Your bombers arc out toward the North Sea, pretending to veer off toward Britain. The Dutch exhale, then panic when those same bombers bank and roar back over Rotterdam. The city is flattened in minutes. Rubble replaces rooftops. Streets burn. And suddenly, surrender isn't cowardice, it's strategy. Then come the paratroopers. They drop like steel confetti across key bridges and intersections. Amsterdam stares up in disbelief. Horse-drawn carts try to flee along roads, now choked with smoke and echoes. Dutch forces resist, but it's like throwing pebbles at a locomotive. You're inside their defences before they finish unpacking their maps. Luxembourg. Blink, and it's gone. The whole country folds before the ink dries on your deployment orders. It's not even a battle, it's a bump. Belgium puts up more of a fight. They've seen what you did in Poland, in Norway. They mobilize, coordinate with the British and French. There are trenches, barricades, desperate prayers, but you're not interested in meeting them at their strongest. While they brace for a direct assault, you send your tanks through the Ardennes, the forest they thought was impassable. Surprise! Historians still argue whether the Allies' biggest mistake was trusting the Maginot Line or underestimating the speed of your armour. Maybe both. What's certain is that your panzers emerge from the forest like wolves into a pasture. They hit the French rear lines with such force, entire regiments dissolve before they know they're flanked. And here comes your corridor, the defining feature of Blitzkrieg. You don't aim to crush every soldier. You aim to split, confuse, isolate. You punch a hole, pour in everything you've got, then turn inward. It's not battle, it's strangulation. You don't kill the army, you smother it. The British Expeditionary Force and remnants of the French army retreat. You push them toward the sea, toward Dunkirk. It's a beautiful trap. You pause, not to be merciful, to be meticulous. You want to encircle perfectly, but in that pause, something odd happens. the Allies evacuate. Yes, you heard that right. Thousands of soldiers are rescued across the English Channel by civilian boats, military craft, anything that floats. Dunkirk becomes a miracle, or at least a missed opportunity. Historians still scratch their heads over why you didn't push harder. Some say your generals hesitated, others whisper about fuel shortages or political calculations. Whatever the reason, the trap doesn't close completely. But France is cracked wide open. You split the country like a fruit. Paris lies ahead. The government is in chaos. The people who once dreamed of empire now flee with goats and suitcases. Your troops don't march, they cruise. Back home, the newsreels can barely keep up. Europe is falling faster than you predicted. You feed your people victory like sugar cubes. The Führer is a genius. The army is unstoppable. Morale soars, and with it, your ambition. By June, the French government is negotiating surrender. You force them to sign the armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany was humiliated in 1918. You make them sit in the same seat. It's not diplomacy, it's theatre, revenge, dressed in ceremony. The Third Republic dies. In its place, the Vichy regime, a puppet state, technically French, spiritually yours. The North remains occupied. The South smiles politely and obeys. You don't need a flag in every corner, just enough to keep the trains running and the rebels afraid. You've done it in 6 weeks. You've accomplished what the Kaiser failed to do in 4 years. You've conquered France, not just with force, but with finesse. The world stares, the Allies reel, your people cheer, and you start wondering, what next? But that next step can wait for one more night. Now you stand on the cliffs of the Atlantic, boots pressing into conquered soil, gazing across the grey expanse toward Britain. France lies behind you, like a postcard torn in half, and still you're not satisfied. You don't do satisfied. The Blitzkrieg has worked too well. It's addictive. Every victory shortens your patience, sharpens your hunger. And England is the last real wall standing between you and the idea of total European control. But crossing the Channel isn't like rolling through the Ardennes. You can't Blitzkrieg water. Britain is a fortress wrapped in waves, shielded by the Royal Navy and powered by stubborn defiance. Still, you try. You call it Operation Sea Lion. Poetic, absurd. A plan to invade England itself. Step 1. Obliterate the Royal Air Force. You need the skies before you can dream of land. And so begins the Battle of Britain. You unleash the Luftwaffe with everything you have. Dogfights scorch the air above London and Dover. Bombs fall like punctuation marks on cities and airfields. At first, it looks promising. The RAF loses planes and pilots at alarming speed. Your generals beam. A few more weeks, they say. Just a few. But Britain is made of something sticky and inconvenient. Resilience. Radar, a newfangled thing the British have quietly perfected, gives them eyes in the fog. Fighter Command, led by Hugh Dowding and a ragtag team of steel-nerved pilots, plays a deadly game of cat and mouse with your Messerschmitts. And then the turning point. A British bombing raid hits Berlin. It's small, barely a scratch, but your pride swells like a bruise. In rage, you switch tactics. You stop targeting airfields and command centers. Instead, you bomb cities, civilians. You call it retribution. The British call it the Blitz. But here's the irony. In trying to break their spirit, you hand them clarity. The RAF rebuilds. Morale hardens. Churchill delivers speeches that rattle rafters. "We shall never surrender," he roars. Children sleep in tube stations while mothers boil tea beside cratered gardens. The more you bomb, the less they budge. Historians still argue whether your shift in bombing strategy cost you the battle. Some say the RAF was already rebounding. Others insist your wrath handed them the breathing room they needed. What's certain is that Sea Lion never roars. Your invasion plan stays theoretical, filed under someday next to your dreams of building a Germania bigger than Paris. Frustrated, you look south. Italy, your Axis buddy, has been playing war like a drunk at a chessboard. Mussolini bungled Greece. He's faltering in North Africa. His tanks are slow. His troops are tired. So you do what any overachiever does. You take over his homework. You send Rommel, the desert fox, to Africa. North Africa is a sandbox of ambition. Control it, and you control the Mediterranean. But here, tanks don't glide. They crawl, stall, overheat. Sand clogs gears. Supplies vanish into dunes. The British fight back with tenacity. You win some, lose some. It's not Blitzkrieg. It's a tug of war, and you hate it. Back in Europe, you start reorganizing. France is divided. Vichy in the south, a polite puppet regime run by Marshal Pétain. They smile, wave flags, and do your bidding while pretending to be independent. Meanwhile, your troops hold the north. Paris is under your heel, its cafes and boulevards quiet beneath your boots. French resistance begins to whisper, but it's still a whisper. For now. And so, with Britain unconquered, Africa in flux, and France under your thumb, you start thinking long term. You've secured the West, more or less. You've swallowed half the continent. You could pause, consolidate, maybe build those massive halls and statues you sketched with Spear. But you don't pause. Because to you, peace is not stability. Peace is stagnation. And there's one more giant on your map. One that scares and excites you in equal measure. The Soviet Union, your uneasy partner, your ideological opposite, your inevitable target. But that front waits for tomorrow's plans. Tonight, you dream of steel and snow. June 22 on 1941. You give the word. The largest invasion force the world has ever seen begins to crawl east. Over 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft thunder toward the Soviet Union. You name the operation Barbarossa, as if evoking the beard of an old crusader will lend the endeavor divine legitimacy. It's not just an invasion, it's a gamble, so massive it makes Vegas blush. Why the East? Simple. Lebensraum, living space. You believe the East is your destiny, not metaphorically, literally. You want to empty it out, fill it with Germans, and maybe grow some wheat where people used to live. The Slavs, subhumans in your racial fantasy, the land ripe for the plunder. Stalin is a monster, yes, but you think he's slow, soft, unready. Spoiler, he's all of those things at first. The invasion begins like clockwork. Blitzkrieg again. You split your army into 3 prongs. One for Leningrad, one for Moscow, one for Ukraine. The first weeks are breathtaking. Soviet troops are caught napping, quite literally, in some cases. Airfields are bombed before planes can take off. Divisions vanish in encirclements so large, generals run out of maps. Kiev falls. Minsk burns. Your forces push hundreds of kilometers into Soviet soil. It's as if the Blitzkrieg has found its final form. And yet, the cracks appear early. Logistics falter. The further you go, the thinner your supply lines stretch. Fuel doesn't sprint like your Panzers do. Roads vanish into mud. Soviet railways run on different gauges. Lovely, frustrating detail. You strip local towns of horses, carts, labor, anything to keep going. It works. Meanwhile, Stalin awakens. His purges gutted the officer corps, sure, but the Red Army is vast, and now it's angry. Factories are evacuated eastward, entire cities placed on rails and moved beyond your reach. Women, old men, children, all become part of the Soviet war machine. This isn't France, this isn't Poland, this is something primal, and it's just beginning to breathe. Historians still argue whether Operation Barbarossa was doomed from the start, or just horribly timed. Some say you could have taken Moscow had you focused. Others insist the very act of invading Russia was lunacy with a frost-bitten mustache. What's certain is this: your war has changed. You're not dancing anymore. You're digging. Autumn brings mud, the Rasputitsa, the season where roads become soup. Your tanks stall, horses die in droves, soldiers sleep in frozen boots. Yet you keep pushing. Moscow is in sight, so close you can smell the soot on Stalin's coat. But winter comes early, Russian winter, the kind that breaks bones just by looking at them. Your men lack proper coats. Their guns jam. Meanwhile, Siberian troops, fresh, well-equipped, trained in snow warfare, arrive by the trainload. They counterattack. Suddenly, for the first time, your Blitzkrieg doesn't just stall, it shatters. You lose ground, thousands freeze, fall, or flee. Still, you refuse to retreat. That's not how you work. You issue orders forbidding withdrawal. Whole divisions are encircled because of your pride. The Eastern Front, meant to be your masterpiece, becomes a graveyard painted in grey and red. You don't understand the Soviet capacity to absorb pain. You keep thinking they'll collapse any minute now. They don't. Back home, the propaganda machines crank louder. They show victories while hiding the reality. Mothers stop receiving letters. Wives whisper in food lines. And in your bunker, you start rewriting maps to reflect dreams, not facts. The Soviet Union doesn't fall. It endures. And you've opened a front too wide, against a foe too stubborn, in a climate too cruel. But that realization will wait until the snow thaws. Spring 1942 arrives like a grudging truce. The snow recedes, revealing the corpses of dreams and battalions frozen mid-motion. You've survived winter, barely, and now you try to pretend that Barbarossa is still viable. Your maps say you're winning, your generals nod a lot, but your eyes dart eastward, always measuring the distance to Moscow and wondering why it still stands. So you pivot. If Moscow won't fall, perhaps the South will. You set your sights on the Caucasus, rich with oil, the bloodline of your military machine. Without fuel, your tanks are just armoured furniture. And so begins your southern campaign, with one name on everyone's lips, Stalingrad. It's just a city. That's the first mistake. It's a name, yes, but also a symbol. Stalin's name. That's the second mistake. You think taking it will shatter morale, cut supply lines, and secure your advance into the oil-rich region beyond. But Stalingrad isn't just concrete and brick. It's where your momentum turns to mud. Again, you send the Sixth Army under Paulus. They begin the assault in summer. The Luftwaffe reduces whole districts to ash. The city burns. Civilians fight beside soldiers. Sewers become trenches. Factories become fortresses. Every floor of every building is a battleground. Blitzkrieg doesn't work in ruins. Your tanks can't maneuver. Your planes can't differentiate between friend and rubble. And the Soviets, they bleed, willingly. They trade land for time, life for inches. Then, as autumn rolls in, they surround you. Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement, slams shut around the Sixth Army. Suddenly, your conquerors become the besieged. Paulus begs to retreat. You say no. You always say no. Withdrawal is weakness, and weakness doesn't fit your narrative. But this time, the narrative doesn't care. Supplies run out. Ammunition dwindles. Frost creeps in again. Starving soldiers eat horse meat, then rats, then wallpaper. On February 20th, 1943, Paulus surrenders. The Sixth Army, 300,000 strong at the start, is annihilated. Stalingrad is your first public, undeniable catastrophe. Historians still argue why you refused Paulus permission to break out. Some say it was ego. Others believe you truly thought relief would arrive. Perhaps you just couldn't imagine losing, but you did, badly. Meanwhile, on the home front, whispers grow. Your victories were lightning, now they're static. The death notices pile higher than your speeches. Cities bombed by the Allies begin to look like the ones you once conquered. Hamburg, Cologne, even Berlin is touched. The war you exported is now returning. You try to keep the wheels spinning. You send more troops, more tanks, more lies. The Wehrmacht still fights with precision and bravery, but the myth of invincibility is gone. You blame your generals. You blame the weather. You never blame yourself. Not once. And yet you can't help but glance west again. The Americans have entered the war. You thought you had time before they got involved. You were wrong. Their factories hum like bees on caffeine. Their ships cross oceans. Their bombers grow bolder. The Allies are planning something. You don't know when or where, but the tension builds like thunder behind the clouds. You prepare for an invasion along the French coast. You build bunkers, lay mines, post guards. The Atlantic Wall, you call it, a name as theatrical as it is porous. But your focus is split because the East still burns. The Soviets are pushing back. You try to hold Kursk, a bulge in the front line. You prepare the largest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks clash in the fields. It's epic, and it's a failure. The Red Army holds, then it advances. The irony is painful. Blitzkrieg, your darling tactic, your signature flourish, now used against you. Soviet tanks thunder westward. Your troops begin to retreat. Not tactically, not temporarily, just back. Always back. But that retreat, that unraveling, is something your dreams have yet to admit. It's 1944, and the world is less impressed with your ambition and more concerned with how to bury it. The tides have turned, and not just metaphorically. In fact, if you squint toward the western horizon, you'll see them, the Allies, riding literal tides toward France. The invasion you feared, the one you planned for, with concrete and commandos, has arrived. D-Day. June 6. Normandy. Not Calais, where you poured your defences. No, the Allies, with a flair for misdirection that would make Houdini weep, land where you least expect. Paratroopers drop into French farmland like seeds of liberation. Higgins' boats disgorge men and machines onto beaches you thought impenetrable. The Atlantic Wall holds for a few hours. The Allied troops press forward through mud, blood, and barbed wire. Beaches with names like Omaha and Sword become legends. You, still asleep that morning, wake to the sound of your empire beginning to crack. It's not just a military operation. It's a spectacle of logistics, coordination, and sheer brute force. Over 150,000 men land on day one, and they don't stop coming. Your counterattacks are ferocious but frantic. You send panzer divisions, what's left of them, to stem the tide. But Allied air superiority turns your every move into a glowing target. Bridges disappear, columns explode. Your soldiers retreat through hedgerows, ambushed by farmers with rifles and scouts with radios. Blitzkrieg no longer works because you're no longer the one doing the blitzing. Back on the Eastern Front, the Soviets have launched Operation Bagration. You remember Stalingrad. Multiply that by 5. Belarus becomes a graveyard for Army Group Center. Your forces are routed, cities liberated, collaborators panicking. Soviet troops advance west like lava, deliberate and devastating. Every kilometer costs lives, but they keep coming. And inside Germany, the air smells different. Not of victory, or steel, or burnt coffee, but of smoke and fear. Allied bombers turn your cities into mazes of rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, firestorms dance across rooftops. You call it terror. Your enemies call it justice. Civilians dig through ruins. Food grows scarce, so does faith. Historians still debate how much the bombing campaign weakened your war effort. Some argue it crippled your industry. Others claim it galvanized resistance. What's certain is that it changed something in the air, not just the oxygen, but the hope. The German people no longer see you as the bringer of greatness. They see ashes. And then comes July 20th, a brief flicker of rebellion within your own ranks. Claus von Stauffenberg plants a bomb under your conference table. It explodes, walls buckle, officers die. You survive, singed but alive. You use it to purge more traitors, executing hundreds, but the myth of your invincibility, already bleeding, now wheezes on the floor beside you. You lash out with desperation, masquerading, as strategy. You draft teenagers into battle. You conscript old men with rheumy eyes and memories of the First War. The Volkssturm, People's Storm, sounds poetic until you realize it's just boys with rifles. And still you refuse to see the walls closing in. You issue orders detached from reality. You insist Paris be defended to the last man. The Wehrmacht withdraws anyway. The city is liberated in August. No epic siege, just German officers slipping away, uniforms stuffed into duffel bags. France breathes again. Italy, your limp-wristed ally, has already switched sides. Mussolini's regime collapses. He's imprisoned, rescued by your commandos, and then paraded around like a wax puppet. Eventually, partisans catch him trying to flee. They shoot him, hang him upside down. A prophecy in reverse. The Reich is shrinking. Borders contract. Every map is a countdown. You once dreamed of spanning continents. Now you're calculating kilometers. Not to gain, but to keep. Every village held is a delay. Every hour bought is borrowed from the future you swore would last 1,000 years. But that future is arriving late and wearing unfamiliar boots. By early 1945, your empire resembles a child's sandcastle, once proud, now melting under relentless waves. From the west, American and British forces push through the Siegfried Line, scattering what's left of your defences. From the east, the Red Army storms across Poland with the fury of the damned. And you're back in Berlin, beneath the city, entombed in your own bunker, scribbling fantasies on war maps that no longer reflect reality. This wasn't the plan. Not your 1,000-year Reich, not your triumphant domination of Europe. But facts are stubborn. Cities you once paraded through now spit out your troops. Soldiers once drunk on victory now retreat through villages that reek of smoke, sewage, and despair. You've run out of flanks to outmaneuver. The war is no longer about tactics. It's about attrition, and you've run dry. Your last great offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, briefly reignites the illusion. December 1944. You throw what reserves you have left into the Ardennes again, hoping to cleave through the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. It's a bold move, a reckless one, and at first it works. Surprise punches holes. Fog grounds, Allied planes, towns fall, panic spreads. But then the weather clears. The Allied response is swift, coordinated, overwhelming. Patton's tanks roll like thunder. Your offensive grinds to a halt. Your panzers run out of fuel. Your soldiers run out of food. And your dreams run out of oxygen. The bulge flattens. You've spent the last coin in your purse of war. Now there's only debt. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front isn't a front anymore. It's a flood. The Soviets breach the Oder River. Berlin is in their sights. As they march west, they uncover the unthinkable. Death camps. Treblinka, Majdanek, Auschwitz. They find gas chambers, crematoria, piles of shoes, suitcases with names, hair shaved from heads, now ashes. The world begins to understand the full scale of your industrialized nightmare. Historians still argue about your mindset in these final months. Did you truly believe in victory? Or were you buying time for one last miracle? One last weapon, the V-2 rockets, the jet planes, the whispered atomic bomb? None of it matters. The Allies seize your factories, your secrets, your scientists. What you built to last forever is scavenged in weeks. Inside Germany, reality cracks. Refugees clog the roads. Cities starve. Morale collapses. Your speeches, once thunderous, now echo in empty halls. Goebbels is still with you, still spinning delusion from the ruins. But even he smells the end. The people whisper of surrender, of suicide, of silencing the radios forever. You order scorched earth, the Nero decree. Bridges, power plants, railways, all to be destroyed so no enemy can use them. Your own minister, Albert Speer, ignores you. Even your inner circle sees your commands, not as law, but as madness. You're not a leader anymore. You're a ghost with a mustache. April arrives. The Soviets encircle Berlin. Shells fall like rain. The city becomes a battlefield, block by block, staircase by staircase. You retreat deeper into the Führer bunker, clinging to blueprints and betrayals. You marry Eva Braun in a moment of theatrical romance. Less than 40 hours later, you both swallow cyanide. You shoot yourself, just to be sure. Outside, Berlin crumbles. The Red Army captures the Reichstag. Soldiers plant their flag. In a storm of dust and blood, the city falls. Germany surrenders. The war in Europe ends. But your dream, your twisted, blood-soaked fantasy of conquest, died before the bullet. It died in Stalingrad, in Normandy, in the snows of Moscow, and the mud of Falaise. It died every time someone said no. Every time your soldiers looked back instead of forward. Every time you mistook fear for loyalty. And now only silence remains, and questions. So here you are, not literally, of course, but as the echo in the aftermath. Germany lies flattened. Europe is a jigsaw puzzle of rubble and smouldering sorrow. And your almost victory, it lingers, an eerie whisper in history's ear. How close did you come? That's the question now, the one historians sip their tea and wrestle with, sometimes while nervously glancing at globes. Let's review. By mid-1941, you controlled most of continental Europe, from the Bay of Biscay to the gates of Leningrad, from the North Cape to North Africa. Your empire sprawled like an ink blot on the world map. France had fallen. The Low Countries were yours. Scandinavia trembled. The Balkans were annexed, absorbed, or occupied. Even Italy bowed, albeit clumsily. And Britain, well, Britain was technically undefeated, but boxed into an island, living on canned optimism and imported rage. You almost made it. Had Moscow fallen in 1941, and you were so close, the Soviet infrastructure might have collapsed. Had you pressed at Dunkirk, instead of halting your panzers, perhaps Britain's army wouldn't have escaped. Had you not declared war on the United States in December 1941, a bizarre strategic tantrum, the American war machine might have stayed idle a little longer, sipping Coca-Cola and playing baseball. Historians still argue whether your downfall was fate, ego, or logistics. Probably a casserole of all three. Blitzkrieg worked until it didn't. It was never designed for drawn-out campaigns. It was shock therapy for unprepared nations. Once your enemies adapted, once they built more planes, cracked your codes, and dropped bombs like confetti, the tide turned. And you, who once moved armies like chess pieces, started reacting instead of planning. And then there's the moral rot. Even if you had conquered all of Europe, the foundation of your empire was genocide, not diplomacy, not ideology, but annihilation. You didn't just fight wars, you designed extermination. Ghettos, camps, trains that ran on time and terminated in gas. That's not conquest, that's cruelty turned into policy. Would Europe have tolerated it? Would the puppet regimes have endured the mass deportations, the repression, the cultural sterilization? For a while, maybe. But beneath every occupied town, resistance brewed. Under every tricolour flag in storage, someone plotted. No empire built on fear sleeps well at night. And there's the United States, your ideological mirror image in some ways. Industrial, vast, mythic in self-image, but functioning on very different principles. Once provoked, it mobilized with terrifying speed. The arsenal of democracy, they called it. Ford built tanks. Boeing launched bombers. Even the soda fountains whispered revenge. You awoke a continent, and it rolled toward you with steel and vengeance. So yes, you nearly conquered Europe. You had the pieces, but you lacked the patience, the pragmatism, and, most importantly, the humanity to hold it. Your dream required not just obedience, but silence. And people, even broken ones, don't stay silent forever. Now as the dust settles, the reckoning begins. Nuremberg trials, testimonies, films projected onto the ruins of what used to be cities. Survivors speak, Perpetrators lie, records scream, the world looks at your deeds and invents a new phrase, crimes against humanity, because language wasn't ready for you. And those who ask what if, they mean militarily. Could you have won? Could you have held Europe under your boot? But the better question is, what kind of world would that be? What would sleep feel like under such silence? And that is the lullaby history sings. So no one dreams of Blitzkrieg again. But before the last gun falls silent, let's rewind a bit, not to the victories, not even to the ruins, but to the gears turning behind the front. Because your near conquest of Europe wasn't just fought with tanks and Stukas, it was choreographed with pencils, paper clips and paranoia, bureaucracy, your unlikely sword, 1,000 officers humming, 1,000 typewriters clicking away death warrants and ration slips. You don't run an empire on charisma alone. You need paperwork. You need quotas. And oh, did you love a good form? Every train schedule that brought cattle cars to Auschwitz signed. Every requisition for Zyklon B catalogued. The banality of evil didn't just wear a uniform. It had a filing cabinet. And it was efficient. Scarily so. Historians still debate whether Nazi Germany was the most efficiently mismanaged empire in modern history. Your ministries tripped over each other, rivalries sprouted like weeds, and yet somehow everything moved. It worked, not because it was perfect, but because fear greased the wheels. Dissent didn't just ruin careers, it ended them. Meanwhile, in occupied Europe, your administrators redrew borders as if nations were jigsaw puzzles. Poland, gone. France, halved. Czechoslovakia, picked clean. You installed puppet regimes like Decor, Vichy in France, the Arrow Cross in Hungary, quislings everywhere. Some cooperated eagerly, others under duress. A few tried to walk the razor-thin line of survival. But you underestimated the power of people with nothing left to lose. Underground networks blossomed, messy, brave, and annoyingly persistent. The French resistance sabotaged rail lines with piano wire. Polish partisans ambushed your patrols in forests you couldn't map. In Denmark, entire fishing communities smuggled Jews to Sweden under the noses of your occupiers. Still, the core of your near victory wasn't just military or administrative, it was psychological. You convinced an entire nation to believe in your vision. You blended myth with grievance, promise with punishment, the Treaty of Versailles, a convenient villain, the Aryan myth, a ladder of supremacy you urged everyone to climb at any cost. It worked too, for a time. Your rallies shimmered with torches and orchestrated fury. Your speeches crackled through every radio, every schoolroom. You sold revenge, and it came gift-wrapped in patriotism. Germany bought it until it broke them, and your military. For all its terror, it was engineered with terrifying elegance. The Wehrmacht didn't just fight hard, it fought smart. Tactical innovation, adaptability, and stunning speed made it seem invincible. Even your enemies admitted it. British generals grudgingly admired your precision. Soviet commanders copied your strategies. American analysts turned your doctrines into case studies. But your undoing. Hubris. Always hubris. You stretched too far, too fast. You trusted no one, fired your best commanders, micromanaged from bunkers, and refused retreat when retreat was the only sane choice. You weren't just beaten by better weapons or bigger numbers, you were beaten by your own belief that you could bend history to your will. So now, as the war winds down, those who studied you aren't just measuring miles gained or lives lost. They're asking how close madness came to being normalized. How many more years or even months might have tilted the balance? What if Japan had delayed the Pearl Harbor attack? What if you'd waited to invade Russia? What if the Allies had lost their nerve just a bit longer? These aren't questions for glory, they're cautions, because the story of how you almost conquered Europe isn't a tale of near triumph. It's a study in how fear, desperation, and a very convincing liar can almost dismantle a continent, but almost isn't destiny. As the Third Reich lies in ruin, you or what remains of your legacy seep into the cracks of history like a bitter fog. The physical map of Europe may be redrawn, but the psychological one, that's been scorched. The question now isn't just how you almost won, it's how the world ever let you get that far in the first place. Let's talk appeasement, that lovely soft-sounding word that let you gobble up territories like a child, let loose in a candy store. You remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, technically illegal, diplomatically outrageous. And what did Britain and France do? Issued a strongly worded memo and went back to their tea. You annexed Austria under the guise of Anschluss, Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, yours too courtesy of the Munich Agreement. Chamberlain even waved that paper like it was a golden ticket to peace. Historians still debate whether appeasement was naive or simply exhausted pragmatism. Europe was still reeling from World War I. Nobody wanted a sequel, especially not one starring you, so they let you creep forward, one grab at a time. And by the time Poland was invaded, it wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the last step in a very loud march. You didn't win those early conquests with sheer force alone. You won them by exploiting hope that you'd stop, that you weren't serious, that maybe the mustache and rants were just political theatre, but you weren't joking. And by the time the world realized, your tanks were already parked in their town squares. And then there's propaganda, your second army. You knew that a lie repeated often enough becomes policy. You turned newspapers into weapons, radios into symphonies of rage. Children learned arithmetic by counting Jews. Teachers swapped textbooks for manifestos. Art became geometry of loyalty. Film reels glowed with ideals, purity, sacrifice, glory. Reality was optional. Inside Germany, opposition shrank into whispers. Outside, nations hesitated, hoping someone else would blink first. Meanwhile, you built an empire, not just with steel, but with silence. The silence of neighbors who saw Jews disappear and said nothing, of politicians who feared headlines more than history, of allies who suspected your ambitions but lacked the stomach to stop them. And what about the economy? You resuscitated a broken Germany, didn't you? Autobahns, employment, industry, all booming. But it was illusion propped up by rearmament, stolen wealth, and the looming shadow of war. You didn't fix the economy, you weaponized it, and the bill came due in body bags. For 2 years your gamble worked. You shocked the world with speed and audacity. Your enemies stumbled, regrouped, and finally struck back. But just imagine if they hadn't. If Britain had sued for peace after Dunkirk. If America had stayed isolationist, if Stalin hadn't recovered from your betrayal, would your empire have calcified? Would children have learned your name in reverence, not revulsion? Would Europe have become a grey continent of surveillance and marching boots? Perhaps, for a while, until the weight of your lies collapsed the very world you built. Because conquest is never the end game. It's the upkeep that breaks you. The resentment, the resistance, the cracks. Your ideology required too much fear, too much brutality, too much control, and eventually people stop running. They stand, they fight. Not all, not always, but enough. So while you nearly conquered Europe, what you really did was test its resilience. And though it broke in places, though it burned and bled, it didn't disappear. The bones remained, the soul, dented but not shattered. And that's how history remembers you, not as the one who won, but as the warning that nearly did. Let's now drift away from the burning cities and zoom into the quieter, more uncomfortable truth, the collaborators. You see, while your Wehrmacht marched and your Luftwaffe screamed overhead, not every town fought back. Some doors were opened willingly, some salutes returned, and some hands shook yours with a smile. It's a strange thing, betrayal, especially when it wears a familiar face. In France, the Vichy regime didn't just surrender, they participated. They passed laws, rounded up Jews, enforced your decrees with the eagerness of a star pupil. Marshal Pétain didn't need to be coerced. He believed he was preserving order, protecting his people, and so he signed and stamped and nodded. In the Netherlands, in Norway, in the Baltic states, there were others. Local militias, police forces, volunteers for your Waffen-SS. They joined not just out of fear, but ideology, a belief, however twisted, in your vision of a new Europe. For every resistance cell hiding radios in the cellar, there was someone selling them out for a ration card or a sense of belonging. Historians still argue how deep this went. Was it opportunism, hatred, survival? Likely all of it. Collaboration wore many disguises. The bureaucrat shuffling papers, the mayor nodding through deportations, the soldier guarding a train. The line between victim and accomplice blurred more than post-war memory cares to admit. But here's the thing, your near conquest of Europe wasn't possible without them. Without the people who turned away, who convinced themselves it wasn't that bad, who looked at their neighbor's empty house and thought, maybe I'll just take the silverware. You didn't impose evil, you invited it, and millions RSVP'd. Some loudly, some quietly, some by simply doing nothing. And then there were the corporations. You'd think war would ruin business, but some businesses flourished. German industrial giants, you know their names, built your tanks, your chemicals, your planes. But let's not forget the Swiss banks, the French factories, the Dutch companies that profited in shadows. Neutrality, it turns out, was sometimes just good branding. Meanwhile, in places like Ukraine, Latvia, and Croatia, nationalist movements saw you as a vehicle, a chance to settle old scores, gain autonomy, maybe even carve out their own slice of your empire. It was convenient, until it wasn't. You promised independence, then handed out dictatorship, standard package deal. And let's not pretend you didn't notice. You thrived on division. You stoked ethnic rivalries, class tensions, religious fears. You turned Europe into a game board of manipulated factions, and you were always the one holding the dice. But even as you neared the summit, the cracks showed. Resistance grew bolder. The French Maquis, the Yugoslav partisans, the Polish Home Army. They didn't wait for liberation. They lit the match themselves. Every bridge blown, every rail sabotaged, every coded message slipped past your senses. It chipped away at the illusion of permanence. And once the tide turned, the collaborators scrambled. Some fled, some begged, some suddenly remembered their hidden anti-fascist sympathies. But history remembers. Oh, it always does. It whispers names, unearths files, lifts carpets. Decades later, the world would still be putting faces to crimes, still asking how so many looked away. So no, you didn't conquer Europe alone, but you didn't fall alone either. You had help, all the way down, and that's the most haunting part of your legacy. Not just the horror of what you did, but how many hands helped hold the pen. Now, let's talk about Britain, the outlier, the one domino that didn't fall, no matter how hard you shoved. Why? That's the question, isn't it? You had the momentum. You had France. You had the Channel ports. So what happened? Well, first off, you assumed the British would fold. That after Dunkirk, after watching their proud army scramble into boats, leaving behind tanks, rifles, boots, they'd sue for peace. They didn't. Instead, they hunkered down under grey skies, listening to Churchill's gravelly sermons and patching craters with bulldog resolve. Operation Sea Lion, your planned invasion of Britain, never happened. Because to invade an island, you need control of the skies and seas, and you didn't have either. Your Luftwaffe tried, of course. The Battle of Britain, day after day of bombing raids, Stukas diving, sirens wailing, London burning. You called it terror. They called it Tuesday. But it didn't work. The RAF held, barely. But they held. Spitfires danced over the white cliffs. Pilots, many just teenagers, fought until they fell or flew home with bullet holes and prayer. And the British, they just kept going. Underground during air raids, rationed and resolute. Dunkirk may have been a retreat, but it became legend, a spirit, a myth you couldn't kill with bombs. Historians still debate your missteps. Why target London instead of airfields? Why delay Sea Lion until the weather turned? Why underestimate a country that had survived centuries of war and tea shortages? Your propaganda machine declared victory, claimed Britain was trembling, ready to negotiate. But behind closed doors, Churchill was crafting alliances, not terms. He knew you weren't just a threat, you were a plague, and he wasn't in the business of treaties with pathogens. And then came the Blitz. Night after night, you turned cities into firestorms. Coventry, Birmingham, London, entire blocks reduced to ash, but for every building you flattened, resolve stiffened, fire brigades doused ruins, while choirs sang in the rubble. Children were evacuated, not broken. You turned Britain into a poem of resistance. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America watched, nervous, divided, but watching. Roosevelt wanted in, but politics played slow. Still, Lend-Lease deals began, supplies flowed, spies whispered, and while isolationists bickered, Americans read headlines and felt something shift. Had you taken Britain, things might have changed. It would have cut off a staging ground, denied the Allies a Western front, given you full control of the continent. But Britain didn't fall, and so your empire never breathed easy. Because one stubborn island, its empire fraying, its people tired, decided to say no. Not maybe, not later, just no. And so your nearly perfect puzzle had a missing piece, a gap across the channel, a place where resistance wasn't underground, but broadcast nightly. And that voice, sometimes defiant, sometimes exhausted, always clear, reminded the world that you weren't invincible. Britain stood, and in doing so, it became a lighthouse in your storm, and eventually the ships came back. And now we arrive at the point where every gambler rolls one die too many, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, a name that sounds like a sword stroke, and indeed it began like one. Swift, brutal, sharp. On June 23rd, 1941, you launched the largest land invasion in history. Over 3 million German troops surged eastward, supported by tanks, aircraft, and the blind confidence of a man who believed history would bend to his will. And at first it did. The Red Army reeled. Entire divisions vanished in encirclements, so wide they blurred on maps. Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk, cities fell like dominoes. You reached the gates of Moscow with a terrifying speed, your panzers kicking up the dust of Napoleon's own ghost. You thought, surely this is it. One more push, one more shattered line. Then the Soviets will fold like the French. But they didn't. Because the thing about Russia is that it doesn't end. The further you go, the more it becomes a mirror of your own madness. Roads turned to mud, bridges collapsed behind you, and then came the cold. Not just chilly, but a cosmic kind of cold. The kind that snaps steel, cracks oil, and turns ambition brittle. Your tanks froze. Your soldiers, equipped for a spring victory, shivered in summer uniforms. And Moscow didn't fall. Not in 1941. Not ever. Stalin didn't flee. The city held. Reinforcements poured in from the east. Siberians in white camouflage skiing through forests. They counterattacked. Your Blitzkrieg, that beautiful, deadly dance, stumbled for the first time. Historians still debate your motives. Was it ideology, Lebensraum, oil fields, a preemptive strike? Perhaps all of it jumbled in the echo chamber of your bunker. What they agree on is this: it was a mistake, the fatal one. Because now you are fighting a war on two fronts, just as you had feared, just as the generals you ignored had warned against. Britain still defied you in the west, and now, in the east, a bear had awakened, bloodied but unbroken. And then, 6 months later, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. America entered the war, not just as a supplier but as a participant, a juggernaut with factories for veins and oceans for limbs. Now you weren't just outnumbered, you were outproduced, outstrategized, and slowly, inevitably outmaneuvered. But back to the Eastern Front, you didn't retreat, couldn't, wouldn't. Instead, you ordered your troops to hold positions that no longer existed, to fight for supply lines already severed. You fed your men into meat grinders like Stalingrad, where house-to-house combat turned the city into a mausoleum of ambition. And the Soviets? They learned, adapted, outlasted. Their industry moved east of the Urals, beyond your reach. Their morale hardened, their tactics evolved. They began to do to you what you had done to others: encircle, surprise, destroy. Still, you persisted, because admitting defeat meant admitting fallibility, and fallibility was not something you allowed in your mirror. But the facts didn't care. The snow piled up, the bodies too. Your once sharp spear dulled with each mile eastward, and the Soviet counter-offensive, slow, grinding, merciless, began to push you back. You'd wanted quick victory, Blitzkrieg, another France. Instead, you got attrition, you got starvation, you got the winter of night, and with it you got your turning point. So you've hit the wall, not metaphorically, you've hit actual physical walls, ice-caked trenches, impassable forests, and ruins of cities that used to welcome your banners with a shiver. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich, it's now just cold breath against a frost-bitten rifle. And while you're still giving speeches about destiny, reality is quietly sketching your obituary in the snow outside Stalingrad. Let's talk about that disaster. Stalingrad, the name itself seems cursed in your mouth, doesn't it? You committed an entire army to take a city named after Stalin. You thought it would break Soviet morale, be symbolic, and oh, it was. Just not the way you imagined. The city became your trap, your tomb, your perfect irony. Urban combat turned your vaunted Blitzkrieg into a twisted crawl through basements and rubble. Snipers, hunger, frost, disease. Your Sixth Army was swallowed whole. Historians still debate why you didn't pull them out. Pride, stubbornness, the sheer inability to accept that maybe, just maybe, the universe was no longer on your side. Whatever the reason, you left them there, encircled, starving, surrounded by Soviet steel. When General Paulus finally surrendered in February 1943, he wasn't hailed as a hero. You considered him a disgrace for surviving, because in your worldview, dying gloriously was preferable to admitting defeat. Meanwhile, your enemies adapted. America began pounding your western edge with bombers. The British cracked your codes at Bletchley Park. Your war machine, once unmatched, was now being outbuilt and outmaneuvered. The Allies landed in North Africa, then Sicily, and by 1943, Italy itself was flipping sides. Mussolini was out. You had to send troops to hold the boot of Europe together, while your eastern leg was being kicked out from under you. You see, the Blitzkrieg was never designed for defense. Your genius, if it could be called that, lay in offense, in movement, in shock. But now you were retreating, slowly, bloodily, across a continent that no longer feared you, but hunted you. Your generals whispered of tactical withdrawals, of consolidating fronts. You yelled, threatened, replaced them, but the tides kept coming. And then there were the partisans. Remember those collaborators from earlier? Well, their counterparts, those who hid radios instead of resentment, began to rise. In Yugoslavia, Greece, Poland, the forests filled with sabotage and gunfire. Trains exploded. Supply lines vanished. Every town you occupied became a liability, not a trophy. Your propaganda machine sputtered. The lies thinned. People whispered in cellars again, not in fear of you, but in hope of your downfall. The swastika that once billowed triumphantly now hung limp, tattered by wind and riddled with bullet holes. Your empire began to rot from within even before the tanks arrived. And speaking of tanks, your vaunted panzers, once the envy of Europe, began to look tired. Soviet T-34s outnumbered them, outpaced them. American Shermans, though inferior, arrived in waves. You had precision, they had production, and in modern warfare, volume wins. What once was a chorus of synchronized engines became a symphony of stalling retreats. Kursk, 1943, your last grand offensive on the Eastern Front, a colossal gamble with everything you had left, and it failed, not just tactically, but symbolically. The myth of your invincibility cracked audibly across Europe, and as your enemies closed in from all sides, your answer was to double down. More decrees, more forced labor, more executions. You didn't pivot, you spiraled. The war wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but your victory was already a ghost. You had almost conquered Europe. Yes, but almost is a word that haunts. It sits at the edge of maps, scribbled where borders were once ambitions. It echoes in ruined cities. It rusts on abandoned tanks. It bleeds through letters from the front that never reached their homes. You almost ruled a continent, and now you're fighting to keep your boots dry in the mud of your own undoing. And now the pincers close, west and east. You once dreamed of a Europe unified under your boot, a patchwork of puppet states saluting in perfect synchronicity. Instead, you're watching that dream unravel, thread by flaming thread. The Allied landings in Normandy, June 6, 1944, D-Day, weren't just a military operation, they were a declaration. Europe would be taken back, one blood-soaked beach at a time. You'd spent years preparing the Atlantic Wall, concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, mined beaches, and to be fair, it looked intimidating. But it turned out, concrete can't hold against courage backed by industry. The Allies came ashore under gunfire, under chaos, under your gaze, and still they came. Americans, British, Canadians, a parade of accents united by one goal, your end. And here's the kicker. You thought the invasion would come at Calais. You were so convinced. You stationed your strongest units there. Even when Normandy lit up with gunpowder and screams, you waited. You thought it was a diversion. And that hesitation, that brief moment of arrogant calculation, cost you everything. Historians still argue how much of that was your fault directly. Some say you were asleep when the landings began. Others say your commanders were too scared to wake you. Either way, it's not a good look when your empire is collapsing and your generals are playing hot potato with responsibility. But once the beachheads held, the tide became a flood. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, split your western defences like a rotten log. Paris, once your jewel, fell without you even mounting a proper defence. The resistance rose from cellars and cafes, turning sabotage into celebration. By August 1944, the City of Light was free, and your shadow there extinguished. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army was no longer trudging. They were sprinting. Operation Bagration, in the summer of '44, annihilated your army group center, a military disaster so vast it made Stalingrad look tidy. Entire fronts disappeared. Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltics, reclaimed in months. The Soviets were now knocking on the gates of Warsaw, Budapest, and eventually Berlin. And how did you respond? Not with retreat, with delusion. You clung to fantasy offensives, ghost armies, and miracle weapons. The V-2 rockets, your so-called vengeance weapons, rained on London and Antwerp, terrifying, yes, but strategically pointless. You were burning resources on fireworks, while your enemies built bridges across your rivers. At home, the situation spiraled. Bombings flattened cities, oil fields dried up, trains broke down, and your once mighty war economy turned into a patchwork of desperation. Slave labor, once hidden in camps and factories, now became the backbone of your logistics. Your people were tired, hungry, and increasingly unwilling to chant your name. Oh, and let's not forget July 20th, 1944, the day a bomb nearly ended it all, placed under your table by men who had once believed in you. They'd seen enough. The war, the executions, the insanity. They tried to kill you. They failed, barely, but the message was clear. Even your own inner circle no longer trusted your hand on the wheel. You responded the only way you knew how, with more fear, more executions, more purges. The SS went from policing Europe to policing each other. Trust dissolved, paranoia festered, and still the Allies advanced. In the Ardennes, you launched one last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. A surprise winter offensive meant to split Allied lines and force a negotiation. At first it worked. Fog cloaked your movements. American units reeled. Bastogne was surrounded. But then the sky cleared, and so did the outcome. Allied air superiority returned. Reinforcements surged. The Bulge collapsed. Your last offensive in the West became your final retreat. Now your empire was not only shrinking, it was imploding. Territory once claimed with triumphant parades now held resistance fighters, advancing enemies, and the ghosts of failed promises. Your borders, once bold on maps, were being erased, inch by boots you could no longer stop. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was a slow fall, filled with denials and desperate speeches. You hadn't lost Europe all at once. You lost it in pieces, in forests, in factories, in basements, lit by candles and whispering radios. And soon you would lose Berlin too. But that can wait until tomorrow. You always imagined Berlin as untouchable, a capital not just of a nation, but of an idea, your idea, marble, banners, statues, grander than Roman ones. You even had blueprints ready for Germania, your fantasy supercity, with domes so large they'd make the heavens blush. But now the only architecture getting finished is rubble. By early 1945, the Red Army is clawing its way through the ruins of Eastern Europe, city after city falling like dominoes that you spent a decade lining up. Stalin's men, furious, methodical, cold as the Russian steppe, are approaching with a terrifying precision, and they remember everything. Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kiev, every massacre, every burned village. They are not coming for land, they are coming for justice. Meanwhile, the Western Allies push through Germany itself. The Rhine is crossed. Cities like Cologne and Frankfurt are taken with shocking speed. American and British troops liberate concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, and the photos begin to circulate. The world gasps. But you stay in your bunker, growling at the walls. Historians still argue why you didn't flee. You had options, planes, routes, even offers from those clinging to your fading orbit. But you stayed in Berlin, beneath the Reich Chancellery, in that underground tomb of concrete and paranoia. Some say it was pride, others say it was cowardice, masquerading as loyalty to your dying nation. You called it destiny, but history calls it a trap of your own making. Above ground, Berlin becomes a hellscape, the Battle of Berlin. April to May 1945 is not a fight, it's a demolition. The Soviets surround the city, then squeeze it like a vice. Shells fall like rain, artillery fires day and night. Civilians shelter in subway tunnels, turned into morgues. The Wehrmacht, SS and Hitler Youth, yes, you sent children with Panzerfausts, try to hold the line, but lines mean nothing now. Your generals beg you to escape, or surrender, or do anything other than mumble about final victories and betrayals. You shake hands with ghosts. You move divisions that no longer exist on maps, that no longer matter. Eva Braun joins you in the bunker, and you marry her in a ceremony that feels more like an obituary than a celebration. The Allies from the West and the Soviets from the East finally meet at the Elbe River. Germany is carved up like a cake before the candles are even blown out. Your Reich which once claimed a 1,000-year future, now has days left, hours even. And then the moment, April 30th, 1945. You take your pistol, she takes poison, the dog gets tested first, because you trust no one. And then it ends. Not with a speech, not with a fight, but with two bodies, a bullet, a cyanide capsule, and a burning corpse in the garden. Outside, the Red Army raises the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. Inside, your empire collapses in on itself, not with honor, but with the whimper of failed dreams and unpaid debts. Your legacy becomes a cautionary tale, a name spoken in hushed tones, or screamed in anger. The ruins of Berlin are picked over. Your plans, the domes, the rockets, the strange esoteric fantasies, become museum curiosities, or chapters in books filed under How Not to Lead. The city you once imagined as the center of the world is now divided, east and west, wall and wire, a concrete scar born from your ambition. And Europe, bloodied, traumatized, divided, begins to breathe again. But it will take generations for that breath to steady. You nearly conquered a continent. You built a machine, fueled by fear and precision. But in the end, your empire, like all empires, was mortal. It roared, it burned, and then it was gone. Now, all that remains is silence. So here we are. The guns have fallen silent. The maps have been redrawn, not in your favor. And the world that once held its breath beneath your Blitzkrieg is now exhaling smoke, grief, and disbelief. Germany lies shattered, not just physically, but spiritually. The Reich you bragged would last a millennium barely made it to its 12th birthday, hardly enough time to blow out the candles. In your absence, and oh what an absence, a reckoning begins. The Nuremberg trials emerge from the ashes, not just to punish, but to define. What is a war crime? What is justice after apocalypse? Men who once clicked their heels and barked, "Heel," now stammer behind microphones and translators. I was just following orders, they say. But the world is no longer buying it. Historians still debate whether justice was truly served. Some war criminals escaped, blending into new lives, even welcomed by Cold War powers, who needed their scientific minds or spy networks. Operation Paperclip, for example, swept up Nazi scientists and handed them lab coats in America. The same men who helped build V-2 rockets now helped put a man on the moon. It's an uncomfortable truth, but truth nonetheless. History doesn't clean its hands easily. Back in Germany, the survivors crawl through ruins. Children born under your regime now play in bomb craters. Cities like Dresden and Hamburg become synonyms for destruction. And yet, life stirs. Bread is baked. Streets are swept. A slow, aching normalcy returns. Not the old normal, but something stitched together from the wreckage. East and West divide under different flags, ideologies, and watchful eyes. Berlin is no longer a capital. It's a metaphor. A city split by wire and concrete. East Germany becomes a satellite of the Soviet Union. West Germany a capitalist outpost, rebuilt under the Marshall Plan. Two Germanys staring at each other across the scar you left. And yet, paradoxically, this split helps Europe survive. The Cold War may chill the air, but it also prevents another hot one, at least for now. Meanwhile, your ideology, your entire hateful gospel of blood and soil, becomes radioactive. No one wants to touch it. Even those who quietly agreed once now feign ignorance. Swastikas vanish, first from flags, then from memory. But the scars, the scars remain. In diaries, in cemeteries, in numbers tattooed on forearms. There's an odd twist to all this. The modern European Union, that sprawling bureaucracy of shared markets and open borders, was in part born from your destruction. The logic was simple. If Europe was economically entangled, war would become too costly, too inconvenient. A continent you once sought to dominate is now bound together, not by fear, but by spreadsheets, treaties, and the quiet desperation to never see another you. And let's talk about Israel. You didn't live to see it, but your genocidal obsession inadvertently galvanized the birth of a nation. Survivors of the Holocaust found their way to Palestine. The world, shamed and shocked by what you had done, supported their claim. In 1948, the State of Israel was declared. History's irony strikes again. You tried to annihilate a people and instead helped solidify their homeland. As for the rest of Europe, rebuilding was uneven. France regained its pride, but not its empire. Britain mourned its dead and tightened its belt. Eastern Europe traded one occupier for another as Soviet tanks replaced Wehrmacht ones. But slowly, the world began to remember how to live. And you became legend, the bad kind. Not a man, but a warning. Textbooks struggle to explain you without sounding like fiction. Movies render you as a caricature. Memes reduce you to a punchline. And yet, every time the world inches toward authoritarianism, your ghost flickers on the horizon like a thundercloud. Because almost, that's the word that haunts us. You almost won. And that almost is why your story must never be forgotten. But now, your empire is dust. Your speeches are static. Your visions of grandeur are museum exhibits and war game simulations. You reached for a continent and choked on it, and all that's left now is the sound of Europe rebuilding itself from your ruin. The final threads of your unraveling aren't pulled by armies or bombs, but by memory and what people choose to do with it. The Nazi regime, once sprawling and disciplined like a monstrous clockwork, now exists only in photographs, documentaries, and the nightmares of those who survived it. And Europe, scarred but alive, tiptoes into its next chapter like someone waking from a fever dream, wondering what was real and what was merely madness made flesh. Germany itself begins the long and awkward process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. It's not tidy. Some pretend not to remember. Some remember too much. Monuments are razed, then vandalized. Names are erased from buildings. Education reforms make it mandatory to learn what happened and how easily it could happen again. A new generation grows up not under your shadow, but inside the light cast by truth. But the world doesn't sit still. In the vacuum of your failure, the Cold War tightens its grip. The Soviets build walls, real and metaphorical. The Americans send jazz and Coca-Cola eastward, and somewhere in the middle, Berlin, that shattered crucible, becomes the front line of ideological theatre. Your dream of a united Europe becomes, ironically, a continent split in half, two systems, two futures, and one iron curtain running through the ashes of your ambition. Historians still debate how close you truly came. Some say you are a heartbeat away from victory. If only you'd taken Dunkirk, or avoided Russia, or let your generals actually do their jobs. Others argue your collapse was inevitable, a mathematical certainty once you stacked enemies higher than your supply chains. Both camps agree on one thing: your strategy was built on speed, terror, and the assumption that the world would flinch. And when it didn't, you had no plan B. The irony, of course, is that you were never a military genius. You were a gambler, a myth-maker, a man whose greatest victories were as much about timing and enemy hesitation as they were about tanks and tactics. And when that myth cracked, when your enemies adapted, when the Blitz slowed, the rest of your house fell like dominoes. But let's not mistake failure for insignificance. You changed the world through horror, through cruelty, through force of will. And it's because of what you did that institutions like the United Nations were born, that human rights declarations were signed, that genocide became not just a word, but a line humanity swore never to cross again, however imperfectly. You almost conquered Europe. You almost rewrote its map, its memory, its soul. Almost. And that almost is the fragile thread that holds our collective sleep together. That reminder in the dark that history isn't just something that happened. It's something we allow or prevent every day. So now, as the dust settles and the world turns its page, your story ends not with a bang, but with a whisper that says, never again. So here you are, lying still as the world turns on without you. The jackboots, the rallies, the grim parades, all gone, faded like smoke after a fire. And above the ruins the stars still shine, indifferent to what you built and what you broke. The cities you shattered are quiet now, stitched back together by people who chose peace, not because it was easy, but because it was the only way forward. You nearly conquered Europe, that's the chilling truth. But truth, like memory, outlasts conquest. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, perhaps you can feel the tremors still echoing, not of bombs or boots, but of questions unanswered. How close we came, how fragile freedom can be, and how essential it is to protect it. Let the whispers of history lull you now. Let the pages turn slower. You've walked through fire, through frost, through silence and sirens. You've seen how one man's hunger can consume a continent, and how that hunger eventually consumes itself. You've watched a world splinter, and a people rebuild from the fragments. And now you can rest. The battle is over. The past has spoken, and though its voice was harsh, its lesson is clear. Sleep now, little emperor of the mind. The lights of Europe burn on, not in your honor, but in defiance of it. Sweet dreams,